They began to whisper at first, quietly, almost fearfully, in battalions, in officers' mess halls, and in carefully worded letters sent home under censorship. Long before Allied bombs reduced Dresden to ash, and years before the sound of Hitler's pistol echoed through the bunker beneath Berlin, some of Germany's most capable and clear-eyed generals already understood a bitter truth: the war could not be won. It was not a single thunderous realization. It crept in slowly, almost imperceptibly, at first a faint unease, then a gnawing doubt, and finally a grim, inescapable certainty. The men who had once basked in the illusion of their own invincibility began to sense the void that lay behind their triumphs. They would continue to obey orders, to lead, and to fight with the same outward discipline, but they would do so knowing, deep down, that the end had already been written long before the curtain fell. In the early summer of 1941, the Wehrmacht stood at the very height of its power. In less than 2 years, the armies of Hitler's Germany had crushed Poland, seized Norway, conquered France and the Low Countries, and subjugated much of the Balkans. The generals who had spent the interwar years feeling humiliated and constrained by the Treaty of Versailles now felt vindicated. Their doctrines of speed, precision, and mechanized warfare had proven themselves. The world trembled before the Blitzkrieg's efficiency. When Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, began on June 21, 1941, many of these men believed they were witnessing the ultimate expression of German military genius. Columns of panzers thundered across the boundless plains of the East. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock's Army Group Center advanced hundreds of kilometers in a matter of weeks. Soviet prisoners poured into captivity by the hundreds of thousands. By the autumn, countless officers were certain that victory was near. Hitler's promise to annihilate Bolshevism in a single, decisive campaign seemed entirely within reach. Yet beneath the confident reports and the celebratory tone of communiques, there was an undercurrent of quiet unease. Some of the older officers, veterans of the First World War, recognized something disturbingly familiar. The front lines were spreading too far, the logistics chains were fragile, and the supply routes stretched perilously thin. Heinz Guderian's armored spearheads raced so far ahead of their fuel convoys that many units ground to a halt, immobilized for want of petrol. The infantry followed days, even weeks behind. And still, Berlin demanded more advances, deeper penetrations, further into the endless heart of Russia. By November 1941, as the first snows fell upon exhausted German soldiers, that unease had hardened into dread. The Soviet Union had not collapsed. New divisions were materializing seemingly from nowhere, arriving from the vast eastern reaches of the empire. The Red Army, bloodied, battered but unbroken, counterattacked outside Moscow. As temperatures plunged to lethal lows, German equipment froze, engines failed, and men perished in their foxholes. The once unstoppable Wehrmacht stalled for the first time. That winter, in icy field headquarters and half-buried dugouts, the first fatal doubts took root. Officers who had once believed they were waging a short, decisive war now found themselves reliving the nightmare they had sworn to avoid, a slow, grinding war of attrition. Supply systems had collapsed, reserves were exhausted, morale was brittle and fraying. Some officers began to whisper what others dared not say aloud. The war was already unwinnable. Others refused to face it. But none who survived that winter campaign could deceive themselves any longer. Germany was no longer fighting a campaign. It was trapped in a vast, endless struggle of exhaustion against an enemy it had disastrously underestimated in every possible way. In 1942, Hitler demanded new offensives to restore lost momentum. The generals obeyed, though their confidence was now hollow. The Wehrmacht launched Case Blue, the grand drive toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the River Volga. On paper, it was bold. In reality, it was reckless. The plan divided the army's strength across enormous distances. Field Marshal von Bock warned against it, arguing that splitting forces between Stalingrad and the Caucasus invited catastrophe. Hitler dismissed him contemptuously. "You always see black clouds," he snapped. Von Bock was relieved of his command. As the armored divisions rolled southward, many officers already sensed that the campaign was doomed by its own ambition. The distances were too great, the supply lines too long, and the Red Army, contrary to Hitler's fantasies, was adapting, learning, and growing stronger. By autumn, German troops were bogged down in the ruins of Stalingrad, fighting a brutal house-to-house battle that bled them white. Reports from the front painted an increasingly desperate picture. The Soviets would not yield, no matter the cost. When the Red Army's encirclement came in November, it shocked Berlin, but not the officers who had seen it coming. For the first time, an entire German field army was surrounded and doomed. Inside the frozen city, General Friedrich Paulus maintained radio contact with Hitler, pleading for permission to break out. The order never came. The Sixth Army was left to die where it stood. The psychological shock was catastrophic. Stalingrad shattered the illusion of invincibility that had defined the Wehrmacht since Poland. Officers who had once laughed at the idea of defeat were now forced to confront it in its purest, most horrifying form. The unspoken question began to spread through the ranks like an infection. If this could happen to Germany's finest army, what hope remained for the rest? The spring of 1943 brought no real recovery, only the illusion of one. The Wehrmacht prepared a massive counteroffensive at Kursk, intended to restore balance to the Eastern Front. Many generals privately doubted the plan. Intelligence made it clear that the Soviets were deeply entrenched and heavily fortified. The element of surprise was gone. Still, Hitler insisted on the attack. Kursk would become the final great gamble of the German army, and its failure sealed the fate of the war. The Soviet defenses held with unyielding strength, and German armor was annihilated in staggering numbers. When the offensive collapsed, the truth could no longer be denied. There would be no more great victories. From that point onward, the German army fought a retreating war, one it could never hope to win. After Kursk, even the most loyal officers began to feel what they had long refused to admit: the end was inevitable. Hitler continued his tirades about miracle weapons and the unbreakable spirit of the German soldier, but those who commanded the armies no longer believed him. They could read the maps. They could see the Soviet forces pressing steadily westward, swallowing city after city, and they knew it was only a matter of time before the Allies opened a second front in the west. For the first time, many officers realized that the war would not conclude in victory, nor even in compromise. It would end in utter destruction. By late 1943, the mood within the officer corps had changed completely. The arrogance and triumphalism of 1940 had dissolved into a cold, resigned fatalism. German industry could no longer make up for the staggering losses. Allied bombers dominated the skies without challenge. The U-boat fleet, once the terror of the Atlantic, was being hunted down and annihilated. Among the generals, the language began to shift. Those who had once demanded unquestioning loyalty to Hitler now spoke cautiously of salvaging what little could still be saved. In private, some began to contemplate the unthinkable, removing Hitler himself. It was not the first time such thoughts had surfaced during moments of crisis, but now, for the first time, they found serious adherents even among senior staff officers. Men like Claus von Stauffenberg, Henning von Treschow, and Ludwig Beck were not merely moral idealists horrified by Nazi atrocities. They were professional soldiers who had come to the same grim conclusion: Hitler was leading Germany to complete annihilation. To kill him, they reasoned, was not an act of betrayal, it was an act of preservation. Yet such thoughts were perilous. The Gestapo's reach was everywhere. A careless word, even in private conversation, could mean imprisonment, torture, and death. For most, it was safer to remain silent, to cling to the faint hope that something, somehow, might still turn the tide. Some pinned their faith on new wonder weapons, others on a supposed rift between the Western Allies and the Soviets. But beneath every excuse, every rationalization, lay the same inescapable truth: the war was lost. In 1944, that truth became undeniable. On June 6th, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. Within days, the German High Command understood that the Western Front could not be held indefinitely. The army was stretched thin across two vast theaters. Fuel was running out. Communications were breaking down. And Hitler's constant interference, his obsession with micromanaging every movement from his map room in the Reich Chancellery, strangled any possibility of coherent strategy. The generals who had once prided themselves on fluid, mobile warfare were now reduced to carrying out suicidal defensive orders issued by a man increasingly detached from reality. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B, saw the truth with painful clarity. During his inspections along the front lines, he confided to his staff that the situation was hopeless. "The enemy's material superiority is overwhelming," he said quietly. "Every day we prolong this war is a crime." Rommel tried to persuade Hitler to seek peace with the Western Allies. The response was fury. When the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler failed, Rommel's name surfaced in the ensuing wave of arrests. Facing the choice between public disgrace and death, he took the only path left to him: suicide. Other senior officers met similar ends. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, commanding forces in the West, also fell under suspicion. Summoned to Berlin, he too chose poison over interrogation. Dozens of others were executed outright. The officer corps, once the proud intellectual backbone of the Wehrmacht, was shattered by its own despair. The failure of the July plot extinguished the last embers of internal resistance. Whatever faint hopes remained of reforming the regime from within, or salvaging a negotiated peace, vanished completely. The surviving generals understood that Hitler would drag the entire nation down with him. Still, many continued to fight, partly out of duty, partly out of fear, and partly because surrender now seemed as dangerous as defiance. By early 1945, Germany was disintegrating on every front. The Red Army surged through East Prussia and Silesia, while the Western Allies crossed the Rhine and drove deep into the heart of the Reich. Cities lay in ruins, industry was paralyzed, and the population faced starvation. Yet Hitler continued to issue delusional orders from his bunker. Cities were to be defended to the last man. Armies that no longer existed were commanded to counterattack. Civilians, old men, and teenage boys were pressed into a desperate, chaotic Volkssturm militia. Many generals no longer obeyed. They falsified reports, ignored orders, or quietly surrendered their forces to the advancing Allies. A few clung to the fantasy that the Western powers might turn against the Soviet Union and ally with Germany in a final anti-Bolshevik crusade. But such dreams were the last refuge of men crushed by reality. By April, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, the last traces of discipline disintegrated. Hitler, isolated and delusional, turned on his own commanders, accusing them of cowardice and betrayal. The once proud German army had become an instrument of chaos, a symbol of a nation consumed by the madness of its own leader. Yet even Hitler, in the end, could no longer deny what his generals had quietly known for years. On April 22, 1945, during a conference in the Führer bunker beneath the ruined Reich Chancellery, he finally broke down completely. In front of his staff, he confessed that the war was lost, that there was no way back, no miracle left, and that suicide was his only remaining escape. For the generals, the moment brought no sense of relief, only a hollow confirmation of what had long been obvious. They had witnessed the disintegration of everything they once believed in, the ideals of honor, of discipline, of the supposed superiority of the German soldier and the nation itself. Some, like General Walter Wenck, tried desperately to save civilians fleeing from the advancing Soviets, organizing chaotic rescue efforts in the closing days. Others simply waited in silence for capture. A few, like Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl, remained loyal to the very end, signing the unconditional surrender that marked the final humiliation of the regime they had served with such devotion. Looking back, one might ask how men so intelligent, so experienced, could have blinded themselves for so long. The answer lies partly in ideology, partly in pride, and partly in fear. Many of Hitler's senior officers shared his contempt for democracy and his obsessive hatred of communism. Whatever they thought of his temperament, they believed he had restored Germany's dignity, revived its military strength, and avenged the humiliation of Versailles. To admit defeat was to admit that all they had fought for, not only since 1939, but since the end of the First World War, had been a lie. Others were trapped by circumstance and by the very structure of the institution they served. The Wehrmacht was not a unified moral entity, but an enormous machine sustained by loyalty, habit, and hierarchy. To rebel against Hitler was to rebel against the entire code of obedience that defined their existence as soldiers. When the first shadows of defeat appeared, most officers chose denial over defiance. When defeat became undeniable, they lacked the moral courage to act upon it. And yet there were exceptions, men like Stauffenberg, Beck, and Trekau, who risked everything to try to end the madness. Their courage, though extraordinary, was not enough. Their failure ensured that Germany's fate was sealed. After July 1944, the war became nothing more than a slow-motion catastrophe, a grim exercise in futility, carried forward by inertia, fear, and the terror of reprisal. Millions more would die in battles already devoid of purpose. Millions more would die in battles already devoid of purpose. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the reckoning began. In Allied interrogation rooms and later in their memoirs, the surviving generals finally spoke freely. They condemned Hitler, the SS, and the Nazi Party. They claimed to have foreseen the disaster and tried to prevent it. Some even portrayed themselves as victims, professionals trapped under the control of a madman. There was truth in some of what they said, but also evasion. Many of those who later claimed to have recognized defeat early had continued to follow orders that prolonged the slaughter. They justified their complicity as duty, as obedience, as the burden of a soldier. The tragedy of Germany's generals was not simply that they understood defeat too late, it was that even when they did, they could not or would not act to stop it. From the frozen plains of Russia to the smoldering ruins of Berlin, the evidence of failure lay everywhere. By 1943, the war was already strategically lost. By 1944, it was militarily hopeless. By 1945, it was morally bankrupt. But long before the final capitulation, in the quiet intervals between battles, many of Hitler's officers had already surrendered in their hearts. They could see what he could not, that Germany's fate had been sealed years earlier, not in the ruins of Berlin, but in the arrogance of 1941, when they mistook the lightning victories of Blitzkrieg for divine invincibility and conquest for destiny. The true tragedy of the Wehrmacht was that it continued to fight long after it knew it had been beaten. In doing so, it ensured that defeat would not only destroy Hitler, but the very nation he had promised to make eternal. Defeat did not come as a sudden collapse, but as a slow creeping awareness, a spreading realization among the very men who had once believed themselves masters of fate. When Hitler's generals finally understood that the war was lost, there was no declaration, no dramatic proclamation, only silence, disbelief, and the slow, inevitable crumbling of faith. They had gambled everything on victory. When that illusion died, there was nothing left to believe in.